Sidnaqdar as a case of transplantation of Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot. In so doing, they retrace this process of adaptation, which culminates in the reactualization, rewriting, and planting of the text into newer soil, a new milieu, giving us what Robert Young would describe as repetition with a difference. Examples of which are the religious symbols which find expression in the transplant, whilst temporality shifts from day in Waiting for Godot to night in Sidnaqdar. Of course, examples abound, but I just noted these two. Now I give the floor to Fabrizia Vita and Paolo Pessimento from Italy, from the University of Messina. Both are researchers in performing arts, and their title of choice is Synchronicity and Diachronicity in the Study of the Sicilian Canto. They will be joining us live from Italy. If you may, Si Khalid, put them on, please.
Synchronicity and diachronicity in the study of the Sicilian canto. In a corner of the garden, a dense group of people made a circle, listening, intent on what one man, seated on a low seat, who was talking. He told about Roger and the very long story of his loss, a long narration without an end. And the people listened to him in silence, sitting around, commoners, old people, children, and without losing the syllable or a gesture or the rhythmic prose with a stick, with the bitter and solemn signs of the face in the monotonous convention of an archaic epic language. But at the gates, the enemy warriors arrive, take up their weapons, the battle begins, amidst the sparkling of the swords, and the prose, little by little, becomes poetry, and the story is transformed in measure and quantity. The words are broken according to cadence and accents, like the metric song of an ancient poem. Another language, the rhythm language of arms, ever more moved and swift and broken, with the prosody of blows and slashes, arm steps, parades, feints, wounds, and deaths, like a dance sacred and warlike, a wonderful revelation of lost time. Faster and faster, more and more glowing, the broken words run at full of the accents, the long and short more and more pressing, until Roger remains alone and victorious. The singer is silent and opens his mild eyes of a black velvet. This passage is taken from Le Parole sono pietre, a documentary novel in which one of the most important Italian narrators of 20th century, Carlo Levi, recounted 3 of his trips to Sicily, which took place in the early 1950s. The writer devoted most of his work to the representation of the disadvantaged living condition of the rural population of southern Italy. In the lines just read, Levi provides a vivid and participatory description of a performance of the Sicilian canto. The passage traces some peculiar characteristics of his form of oral narration. The solitude of the narrator, which can be superimposed on the idea we have to the ancient performance of classical epic poetry, the time of the river tale, the arrangement of a popular audience in a circle around the performer who does not rise on a stage, the use of a simple wand to accompany the strong accents which characterize the parts in poetry more than those in prose. The passage realized in the performance voice from an ordinary diction described with modern convention as prose, and a poem with strongly marked and typically broken rhythms. The artifice of closing the eyes by the performer. It is striking how a performative structure with such a simple appearance can contain such peculiar traits within. Comparing Levi's description of how the canto appeared in the mid-20th century and the contemporary performances of Mimmo Puticchio or Gaspare Balsamo, the only active performance of this peculiar form, it is possible to evaluate the extent to which an oral genre evolves or insists over the decades. Although Levy's account is located in a not so distant time due to the profound changes that have affected the form of popular artistic performance in the 20th century, it is already possible to appreciate a significant difference. First, the performer today resembles less and less a rhapsody of a traditional type, also because he does not receive knowledge as an uninterrupted and direct chain of orality from master to disciple. Mimo Buticchio, during his career, has transmitted his knowledge in the context of workshop, typical of contemporary theatrical pedagogy. He considered himself the last depository of a long tradition. An interruption occurred with his biographical and professional history of the traditional methods of transmission. But in Gaspare Balsamo's words, that knowledge is alive and active. The young performer is the unequivocal heir of a long history of persistent orality. Of course, the handover did not take place for him according to the unwritten rules of that mastery that involves years of silent apprenticeship and more or less sudden baptism of the student by the teacher. But may this be enough to place him already behind the tradition? The conto is no longer a form of popular entertainment. Due to the rediscovery of the tradition that passed through the culture of the end of the 20th century on an intellectual as well as a consumer level, nowadays it is offered to a potentially wider audience. The designated places are disparate. As in contemporary theater, the presence of the stage is not essential, but if it is offered to him, the performer does not reject it at all. The performances in a square with a circular audience arrangement so similar to the Alca of Maghreb have set. It is easy today for a performance of the punto to appear as an isolated event or included in a review including other theatrical forms, rather than being a long season of episodic narratives that animated the Sicilian squares at certain time of the year with appointments at fixed time until 1960s. We could focus on the technique that provides for the narrator to close his eyes in some moments of the story, which according to Valentina Venturini can be traced back to the condition of physical blindness in which the popular storytellers of the punto lived. Disabled workers, ascribable to the long tradition of blind poets, Poeti Orbi, whose ancestry can be traced back to the 15th century. The gesture of great symbolic depth of closing the eyes continues to be practiced in the contemporary punto, but it is not isolated in its peculiarity. In fact, in Gaspare Balsamo's performances, it is possible to detect other characterizing elements attributable to a creative contamination with techniques inherited from the night singers, canta la notte, professions that walked the street on the town at dawn as real living alarm clocks, or by sellers who cried, bagnavano, to advertise their goods in the markets until recently. Among the techniques derived from contamination, for example, the nasalization of the voice, which the performer of the punto obtains by placing an hand between the nose and the mouth to close a nostril and collect the voice in the spoon of the palm to amplify it. Behind the evolution of the elements of the punto, there is a factor that clearly struck Levy's attention more deeply and that continues to amaze the audience of the punto, the typical rhythmic score of his former oral story. Carlo Levi describes this aspect as well. The performer tells a part of the story, then at a certain point, usually near the narration of war scenes, his diction becomes more rhythmic. The narrator breaks the conversation, no longer follows the normal caesuras. In what but and is more and more resembling a speech in verse, he floating unprecedented excitement and effort, thus underlines the internal accents of words. His voice rises in volume and often also in tone. In correspondence with them, a need to catch his breath is so urgent that he is forced to insert a very short pause to breathe even before he finishes pronouncing the word, which thus turns out to be broken as legible states. Now, the issue of the ictus or stroke in the punto is central. In the semantic sphere of this word, whose basic meaning is blow. The idea of the narrated battle and that of the accents that characterize the story itself is concentrated with interesting adherence of signified and signifier. And around the issue of the ictus, it seems that the delicate question of the origins of the punto emerges. The testimonies collected so far are extremely limited. Let us take a step back to a very quick review of the past. On the literary front, more than a century before the publication of Levi's novel, Vincenzo Linares' Il Contastorie, theorized of a predisposition of the Sicilian people to classicism. But the terms which he described as natural classicism were all borrowed from Romanticism, a drive of the spirit to create myths not mediated by any culture, classical or because it was like that of the Greeks, inventors lacking the weight of centuries of literature behind them. Linares coined the word the storyteller, and elevates the figure of the popular fabulator above the role he must have had in real society. At the expense of his forced mytopia between the ancient world and the contemporary world, it is precisely from the Middle Ages that the stories that make up the repertoire of the punto came. In his preface to the collection of popular tales, which also collects Il Contastorie, Linares writes, "The stories that I intend to publish portray old things and times close to us." While others rack their brains to find a ruinous tower in the Middle Ages to evoke from their graves so angry troubadours and beautiful ladies, I study the custom of my country. I unfold these pages. I am inspired by its use in its traditions.
So here we are with my section of the text. So the first scientific study of the Sicilian punto, Giuseppe Pitres, Le tradizioni cavalleresche popolari in Sicilia, the author, explicitly departing from Linares, again brought into play the evidence of an ancestry of the punto from ancient times and referred to the relationships between the living tradition that it could observe and its most ancient sources, through unattainable passages in terms of survival. The attention of scholars turned back to the punto at the end of the 20th century, just as its historical story was beginning to decline, or to start a meaningful change. In the completer and more specific essay on the punto, Guido di Palma dedicates an initial space to the problem of the origins of the punto and affirms peremptorily, it is necessary to address the phenomenon of the punto by distinguishing the events narrated from the narrative event. It is also necessary to reject all those theories based on the prolongation over the centuries of a narrative material concerning the Breton and Carolingian cycles, which make the performance of the punto descend, albeit hypothetically, from medieval jesters and singing poets. So the modern historical and theological reconstructions of the punto place its birth only in the modern age and decisively deny any medieval roots. According to Guido di Palma, the medieval cantari can testify only the persistence of a use, the narration of chivalrous deeds, but not of a specific practice. For example, the rhythmic and broken syntax or the use of the wand, whose continuity should not be considered taken for granted. More than medieval survival, the culto will be, therefore, a form of spectacle that arose between the 18th and the 19th centuries and strongly conditioned by the romantic cultural climate and the ideology of Italian Risorgimento. However, a rigorous analysis of medieval testimonies can encourage reconstruction, albeit partial, without neglecting that in a long-term phenomenon, such as we suppose the culto is, the various characteristic elements are stratified in different eras. For example, the description of Roland as senator of Charlemagne and the band with the Italian tricolor that distinguishes him are clear legacies of Italian Risorgimento. Or the use of the sword instead of the wooden wand is documented with certainty only with Peppino Celano and Mimmo Cuticchio. It is therefore necessary to avoid the perspective error of thinking of the most modern acquisitions as secular legacies and vice versa, of excluding from the analysis those elements whose antiquity can be at least partially ascertained. On this point, we want to reflect through a testimony of the 14th century on an episode of the life of St. Francis of Assisi. According to what we read in the Responsio, composed by the Franciscan spiritual Ubertino da Casale, a friar of the group of St. Francis wished to keep books in derogation from the absolute poverty prescribed by the rule, and asked for a blessing of the saint, who in response issued a harsh rebuke. You friars want to boast of being observer of evangelical poverty, and do as the actors do, who sing the blows of Roland and Oliver and the other warriors without ever having given a blow in battle. What is most striking in this passage is the comparison, but continually deviate from it, and those actors who simulate the blows of Roland, Oliver, and the other fighters. Therefore, St. Francis testifies, first of all, a use, which is obviously very known. We know that the Matter of France had a sensational exploit between the 11th and 14th century with the Chanson de Geste and the Cantari. But we can ask, to a use or also a practice? Indeed, the expression, the actors who sing the blows, which we have translated the Latin histriones cantant ictus, is striking. Our translation, we can say, fails to fully convey the meaning of the original expression, which, however, appears very ambiguous. It is necessary to probe more deeply the terms used by the author. First, the Latin verb cantare has several meanings: to sing, indeed, but also to recite, to declaim, to use magic formulas or rituals, and etc. Now, if St. Francis intended to sing, and were, for example, referring to a musical performance of epic poetry, like those of the jesters, certainly an expression such as cantare gestas could have been more appropriate. If, on the other hand, he referred to a mimic combat action, formulas such as recitare ictus or agere ictus could have been more suitable. It would seem, therefore, that the expression cantare ictus alludes to something different. And to understand it, we must question the term ictus itself, which designates both the blow inflicted with a weapon and the metrics of the Italian vernacular poetry. To trace this evolution, we have to look to Latin poetry, in which ictus indicated the beating of the foot or the finger, which, like a metronome, marked the strong tempos of each verse. But this use as a passage with passage to Medio-Latin and Romance qualitative metrics, which associated the arrangement of tonic accents to and the computation of syllables to this term. We have no more in vernacular poetry a mechanical accent, but a vocal ictus. I skip the more technical questions to say just that the Italian science of metrics of the 14th century, the time of Ubertino da Casale, receives the stabilized idea that the ictus is the rhythmic accent of the poetry. It seems, therefore, that in the passage of the responsio, St. Francis refers to a type of performance whose technical characteristics is a rhythmic modulation of the voice in the specific episodes on the battle scenes. The saints, therefore, seems to be joking with the intrinsic ambiguity of the term ictus to compare and counterpose the actors who cantant ictus, so who rhythmically modulates the blows of warriors, and the warriors themselves who dant ictus, who inflicts real blows in battle. It seems therefore possible that already in the Middle Ages there were oral performances that had something like the practice of the Sicilian conto as we know it today, with its characteristic tension between rhythm and syntax that records a decisive increase in the scenes of battle. So the responsio of Ubertino da Casale would constitute a precious and more ancient testimony than that offered by Antonino Alfano in La Battaglia Celeste tra Michele e Lucifero, that is considered the first testimony of the culto. We have finished our intervention. We want to express our gratitude to Professor Khalid Amin and this wonderful organization. Thank you and see you soon.
Vita and Paolo, our last co-speakers, scrutinize the complex phenomenon of the Sicilian canto, an oral tradition and rhythmic performance occupying a liminal space between ritual and theater. On the synchronic level, Vita analyzes the ways in which the performer moves from the epic to the dramatic register, all the while underlining battle scenes and rhythm as fundamental rhetorical devices. On the diachronic level, Paolo reflects on some of the historical philological reconstructions of the canto, reconstructions which confine its birth to the modern age, thus denying it any possible medieval roots, a claim which Paolo then sets out to disprove. Thank you again to all our panelists. And now we will open the floor for your questions or perhaps your comments, remarks, which could relate to whatever is happening on stage now or what has been going on during the last 4 days or so. So if you have any questions, your questions are more than welcome. Yes, we have somebody from there.
Thank you. So my question is, to what extent the Arabic translation has succeeded to convey and conceive the notion of time in waiting for Godot, taking into consideration the difference of the two cultures, the Arabic and the English, especially in dealing with the absurd theater. Thank you.
Thank you for
If
your
you want, I
question.
translate my translation. There is a translation.
It is already being interpreted for our audience. Any further questions? Yes, please. We have a question from there.
شكرا الأساتذة المتدخلين، كانوا رائعين. التدخلات كانت يعني جد مركزة. أنا عندي غير واحد التساؤل يعني بسيط، هو أن العمل نتاع أوناتوندون غودو لسامويل بيكيت هو يعني عمل يعني كيفاش نقول عنده ضوابط ديالو حتى في ماشي غير في الحوارات بل حتى في الإشارات الركحية يعني الديداسكالي ديالو. فأي خروج على ما يشير إليه كحركات أو أفعال أو على الفعل فهو نص آخر. بالتجربة أن كان غادي زورنا واحد الممثل كان لعب مع سامويل بيكيت، وكنا قدمنا له واحد الجزء من الفصل يعني أوناتوندون غودو، وأذكر أن يعني في واحد المحطة بالضبط نحارف الأداء داكشي اللي مكتوب في النص نحارفنا عليه، واذا بدا كيف التالي قال لنا ديك الحركه اللي درتوها ديك الحركه اللي درتي راه يعني ماشي في النص الاصلي، وبالتالي يعني محموداش يعني محموده. يعني هو يعني الممثل انتبه بان هذيك بالضبط ديك الحركه راه ماشي ما كايناش في النص، وبالتالي العمل يعني نتاع سيدنا قدر هو عمل يعني محايد يعني الى جانب يعني كيف قال الاستاذ المرجوق يسمح لي يمكن ياك الاسم هو هذاك
الاستاذ
المجدقي واس العفو. يعني هو يعني ماشي هو استنباط للروح، ولكن هو كيبقى نص اخر مغاير، لان السياقات نتاع صامويل بيكيت في الخيبات ديالو اللي كانت عنده على الثوره الفرنسيه وكذا او واللي كتبان لنا من اول حوار نتاع اغيان افير بحال هو جواب على كفار نتاع لينين، او في النهايه الحوار الونزي، ولكن كيبقاو جامدين لا امل في التغيير. كيبقى السياقات وفلسفه عميقه مرتبطه بالانسان وكذا وكذا، سياقات تاريخيه مغايره، وسيدنا قدر ابداع خالص مغربي في سياق اخر. وشكرا.
شكرا. الاستاذ.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. حقيقة يعني كانت الجلسة ماتعة. لدي فقط بعض تساؤلات لأصدقائنا في إيطاليا، وربما أيضا الأستاذ بلال. Paolo and you know
Pizzimento. Paolo Pizzimento.
Yes, they can hear us, right?
Can you hear us, Paolo? Vita?
Yes, of course, we can hear you.
Okay, so my question is very simple, because we couldn't manage to have the recording of Katrina, and in her presentation she was extremely, digging into some elements of the conto in contemporary Italian theater. So my question is, how far you have this investment of the conto as a technique, as a dramaturgy in the contemporary Sicilian scene?
Okay. Can I answer your question now?
Yes, Paolo, go ahead.
Okay. Yes, we have to consider that the conto is a phenomenon of essay, so it has a certain importance in the theater of nowadays, but it is not very productive in terms of techniques or style in general for as regard the general scene of theater, is one of the most peculiar forms of the theater of narration, but we can imagine that is a sort of closed scene of in this panorama. So this is due, in my opinion, to the fact that the conto is not a theatrical form in its origins, and keeps conserving its ritual strong origins. So is something that can be compared so easily with the other contemporary phenomena of Italian theater or oral poetry. There is always a strong difference, so it can be no mixed, neither compared with the other theatrical forms. That's naturally is my opinion. At all effects, if we see now a performance of the conto, we see a theatrical spectacle at all, but we can't forget its ritual origins, and after all, these origins are always felt when we see the conto.
Thank you for your answer, Paolo. Before I give the floor to our panelists to react to your question, I have a question coming from George Robertson. Do you hear me?
Yes. Am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we do. Go ahead with your question.
Yeah, great. So, yeah, thank you to the panel and to Jamal. I know that each of the presenters is doing ongoing research. So I would be interested to hear, just a few sentences about what is going to be their next step.
All right, we got your question. We'll react to that in a while. I'll give the floor to our panelists to react to the questions we got from the lady and the gentleman down there.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Jamal. In trying to react to last question, that was a very good question, by the way, because it talks about the theories, I believe, covered in translation studies. And I'm quite sure that you are familiar with the terms coined by Lawrence Venuti, domestication, foreignization, and the other concept coined by Eugene Nida, dynamic equivalence. Now, when we talk about the notion of time, how far has the translator been successful in rendering the notion of time from one source culture into another target culture? Here we're talking about translation, but in fact, our presentation was about transplantation, which to some extent, even though it belongs, it can be used under one umbrella, the umbrella of translation, but it's quite different. However, I'm going to answer you. Now, we can judge that a translation is successful when it has an impact on the target reader, because after all, the source text has an impact on the source reader. When they read it, for example, they get influenced by what is being communicated or relayed in the text. If the translator succeeds at creating the same impact on the target reader, trying to adapt the text to the culture, the target culture, then we would say it is a successful translation, even though I believe there's no scale upon which we can, for example, measure translation. Yes, of course. So here, I believe that Muhammad Qawti was very clever and was very successful in choosing in trying to render Waiting for Godot. And when we say Waiting for Godot, we know that Godot will never come. Okay, the same in the Moroccan, in the Islamic culture, for example, we know that we are not aware of we have been given some signs of when to decide whether this is the Laylat al-Qadr or not, but we never know when it is exactly going to take place. For this reason, I personally believe that he was successful in rendering time. Okay.
Thank you for your comments. Regarding the text Sidna Aqdar, so just to explain and to make the difference between translation and transplantation. So we say transplantation is writing a new text in a new social context. So Muhammad Qawti, he transplanted the spirit of the text. So it's different. It's no more waiting for Godot. It's another text which is completely different, because even in the structure of Sidna Aqdar, there is like in Waiting for Godot, so we have only 2 acts, but in Sidna Aqdar, Muhammad Qawti added another chapter. So here we are in front of a new text that is originally Moroccan, genuine, authentic, because it deals with the popular culture of Morocco. And if you read Sidna Aqdar and reading the lines of the characters, it's purely the Shawia dialects, which is full of rhetorics and examples from real life countryside. So the act of the notion of time you talked about in Sidna Aqdar is the same as in Waiting for Godot, but it's in more details, because in Sidna Aqdar it happens during the night, where in Waiting for Godot it happens during the day. So this is the only difference we have. So transplantation is a new concept we can, which has gone beyond translation and adaptation. That's it.
Thank you for your answer. From Waiting Godot to George in waiting, because George is still waiting for his answer. George has raised the issue of future upcoming research, and his question relates to what your plans are in the future.
Hello, George. So we, how are you? I hope you are very, very well. So we haven't met like 10 years from now. So we met once at the International Center for Performance Studies. And he's a very active member of the International Center for Performance Studies. And we always in contact. He always asks me about the events in the center. So the next step for us is, I've just got our PhD. So we are trying to delve in researching and continue our educational path and research, and try to bridge the gap between translation, transplantation. So George F. Rebelson, he also proofread my PhD, and he knows exactly what I've been doing. And I take this moment to thank you, George, for being of great help to me. Thank you, George. And very nice to see you today with us.
Thank you, Abdurrahim.
Well, I also would like to thank Mr. George. He is a friend of mine. And first time I met him, of course, was in performing Tangier. We share kind of history together. We belong to the archive of this festival. So, hello, hi, George. As far as my, let's say, future research projects are concerned, I'm interested in performance studies, of course, alongside with translation. They are intertwined, of course, and I'm trying to just get more deeply and profoundly into research. So I'm looking forward to meeting you and talking to you soon. I know you're busy, but we just chat from time to time. So hi.
Paulo, Vita, and Bilal, you're also invited to react if you want to George's question.
Yes, thank you for this question. Our interest is to apply the performance studies as a paradigm in a diachronic sense. So we are watching to the Middle Ages, trying to relate the philology with the performance studies. So my attempt, which is just an attempt in a ongoing research, was to analyze a testimony from Middle Ages in a performative way. So what we are going to do in the future is to apply in a wider way the performance studies to the Middle Ages through the texts that the philologies gives us. So this is a research I have made for as regards, for example, Dante, which I study according to the categories of theatricality and spectacularity in the Divine Comedy, but it can be applied to various works, various ages, various authors. So this is our principal argument of research. Thank you.
Thank you, Paolo. That sounds like an interesting idea to pursue. Maybe we can hear from you next year as you'll be presenting the findings of your research.
I hope so.
Yeah, we all hope so. Vita, is there anything you want to add? No, you're fine? Yeah, because I don't want to exclude you.
No. Okay.
So far, so good. How about Bilal? Bilal may have something to add.
Yeah, thank you, George, for your question. Well, as a second year PhD student, I'm actually still in fieldwork, or candidate as a researcher. I'm still in fieldwork in trying to collect all those aspects in terms of social awareness and political activism in Moroccan oral tradition, and especially like collecting in sang poetry, storytelling, and other aspects of the oral tradition in Morocco. I'm more interested in real life consequences of these traditions and how they affect our day-to-day life, and bring them a little bit more to academia in a way to give voice to these people who use our own rituals and traditions to give to voice actually their own issues and the struggles that they go through on a day-to-day basis. So that's it. Thank you so much for your interest in our research as well, and hoping to see you soon.
Thank you, Bilal, for your answer. I don't know if any of you have more questions, because we still have about 20 minutes left. So any comments, questions are more than welcome. Today is the time to debate, I don't know, issues that you still have concerns about. Professor Khalid Amin or Professor Jalid may have a question. Yeah? Go ahead, Professor Khalid Amin.
Maybe just a brief maybe question to Bilal. It's so fascinating. I mean, the research that you are doing, and particularly, you know, the field work that you are conducting in Marrakesh and elsewhere, definitely. And I was very much intrigued by, you know, the quote from Richard Hamilton, The Last Storytellers, and particularly when you contradicted, you know, his claim that, you know, it's a demise of storytelling after sort of, you know, like there were 18 in the 80s, you know, 18 great storytellers in the square of Jamal now, and then 6 of them were left in the late 90s, early 2000 onwards. But now we can speak only about 2, and they are not going down to the square anymore. My last visit to the square, you know, Azalea, we took a group of students from the University of New England, and then I had to call him. And the surprise is that he had to book a space within the square just for like half an hour to perform for us. And then with a kind of interaction with him, I realized that, you know, they are no longer going to the square anymore, but they are conducting workshops elsewhere. I mean, not only Abdul Azalea, but also Muhammad Bari's, you know. I remember also Muhammad Bari's telling me, you know, literally like this, you know, something like, you know, I can't perform on this in the square anymore because it's noisy. So they choose to go somewhere, you know, Darb al-Arij and other venues, you know. Apart from this, of course, they embarked on large projects with the Ministry of Culture, working on texts by, you know, Goiti Solo and Kabir Ibrahim Khatib, and also, you know, Muhammad al-Ash'ari and Kilito, etc. But now I'm very happy to hear the new dynamics in the city of Fez. I heard of this circle of, you know, revival of storytelling, but I'm very happy that now it's really taking shape. There is a new generation learning the craft, and of course, you know, working in different languages, and that's really amazing. And my question maybe is that how can we speak about a decolonial aspect within this process of retrieving a lost tradition and bringing it back, renewing it, maybe in other mediums beyond storytelling? You can find it in biofiction, and you can find it in other genres, etc. So can we speak here of a decolonial somehow aspect of the whole term?
Thank you, Professor Amin, for your stimulating question. Professor Jadid may also have a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to interact with the translation concepts, especially transplantation, foreignization, domestication, and we can also add semantic and communicative translation. Can we compare, or can we make a comparison with the concepts used in Arabic? Tawtain, Sinbad, or Tabia. What's the difference? And is it possible to bring a new text adapted from an original one, either in English or French or any other language? Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Sir Khalid. If we don't have any further questions, then I'll give the floor to our speakers to respond, to interact with you. Bilal maybe wants to.
Thank you, Professor Amin, for your question. I certainly disagree with Richard Hamilton's point of view that storytelling is actually on a demise, because I have witnessed firsthand how it's actually reinventing itself and emerging again in a certain way. And this is exactly what Walter Minuoro says when he talks about the D in the coloniality, and he says that it's the re-emergence of new cultures according to their own terms and stuff. And it is in a way this young apprentices' choice to actually go back to these old traditions and renew it in their own terms. Bring out also when we speak of masters and tools, and then performs in the English language, so that they can, in a way, also avoid the sphere of misinterpretation when they perform to a foreign audience or something like that, because they use the English as a lingua franca, and then they deliver their own ideals. I also think that oral tradition is something that we should look at it as it exists in society and not as it was. And these new apprentices are using storytelling, reinventing it in a way to speak out and showcase their own personality and their own culture, their own attributions to the West in a way. So it is in a way, this new trend is a decolonial trend that can be considered.
Thank you, Bilal.
Thank you again, Mohammed, for your question. To answer you, I believe I'm going to be brief, but trying to be concise. Now, when we talk about domestication and foreignization, we talk about faithfulness to the source text. Okay, I'm trying to make it simple. If the translator, any translator, is trying to be faithful to the source text, then he's applying foreignization. Okay, and this is not good as far as I'm concerned, because you would end up writing a text, translating a text for a reader that they wouldn't understand. Okay, because in order to understand the text, you also need to be knowledgeable about, even for the translator, in order to translate the text, for example, you need to be knowledgeable about the culture in which the text was presented, the original text was presented, and also knowledgeable about the target text, so that you might be able to transfer the meaning correctly, if I'm allowed to say that. And when we talk about domestication, we talk about betrayal. You betray the source text. You don't care about what is being there, about the language used there, for example. You care, all your concern is about your reader, the target reader who is going to receive the text. Even when you are addressing different audiences, different readers from one target culture, for example, if we're talking about Arabic and you are translating, for example, a media text, even the months, for example, in Lebanon, they say Husayran, Kanun al-Awwal, Shabat. In Morocco, we're not familiar with these names, you know. Okay, when we talk about semantic translation, we talk about Peter Newmark, okay? So when we talk about, for example, about foreignization, we talk about semantic translation, we talk about Peter Newmark. When we talk about domestication, we talk about dynamic equivalence. Therefore, we talk about Eugene Nida. So, and I believe you are familiar with the translations of Shakespeare's Othello, the one translated by Jabra Ibrahim Jabra. He tried to apply the semantic translation approach by Peter Newmark, and he failed. He was amazed by the language of Shakespeare, but he failed to transfer the themes, the images of Shakespeare. While, for example, Khalil Mutran didn't pay attention to the language, and he tried to focus on the message being relayed. However, these two translations, even though it is assumed that Jabra's translation was better than Mutran's translation, but we have another translation which is even better by Muhammad Inani, who is familiar for the translating the meanings of the Quranic verses. I hope I answered your question. Okay.
Thank you, Sir Mohammed, for this exhaustive answer. I think George may also want to intervene. George?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up that, you know, we're really depending on these younger scholars. You're the next generation. We're really depending on you, and just to remind you folks, but also to others that trying to you folks, the next generation, was one of the most important things to me. So I'm always very happy to hear from people. If there's any way I can help, I'm always here. And also I know you know, doing this graduate research and finishing your PhD, I know it's one of the loneliest times of life. And so just to give you some encouragement to keep forging ahead, and reach out to people that you think maybe can help you, including me. So thank you and good luck.
Thank you, George, for your words of wisdom and encouragement to our young scholars. I'm sure they'll take heed and follow your steps, the steps of our academics and researchers here who have been persevering for years and years to keep this event going. We still have a few minutes left. 8 minutes. Yes, Mohammed, go ahead. And then I forgot to mention, in trying to answer Mohammed's question, I forgot to mention that according to Henri Lefebvre, each translation is rewriting. So it's impossible that we have the same version of the translated text, no matter what we do. If, for example, all of us are given or assigned a text to translate, then we would end up with different versions, as many the number of the translators we have here. For example, we end up having different versions. No translation is like the source text, because translation is rewriting, and it's all about
relaying meaning.
Thank you, Mohammed. One maxim I keep reiterating to my students is that we don't really translate, we only approximate. That's the idea. That's why we end up with the different versions. And our version is better than the other. It all depends on the purpose of the translator and the meaning they make out of the text, because a text is polysemous in content. So again, it's how you see it and what you make of it. Bilal may have something to say, and then we go to Professor Khalid Amin for the next question. Bilal?
Yeah, I just have one question.
Question or an answer, Bilal?
No, I have one question to get in the conversation actually with Professor Mishdaqi. And I just wanted to ask him whether he thinks that the translator, especially after the cultural turn in translation studies, should take the position of an activist and also, in a way, render the text according to his own beliefs or something like that. For instance, if you're translating Othello and you want to highlight a little bit of the racism or something like that in the play, what would you do? Will you just translate it in a sense, so be more like as it is, or will you be more like an activist and interfere in the original text to showcase the aspects of racism in the play?
I'll give the floor to Professor Khalid Amin before.
Another question about the translation. You know, it seems that the issue of translatability is always on the floor. After Bourdieu's the cultural turn or capital habitus and the field, and definitely. My question is related to how can we speak about the act of translation and transplantation as an act of rewriting of the source text that is, pushing the process of domestication to its extreme. Can we speak here about the decolonial turn of translation or in translation studies beyond the cultural turn that Bourdieu is talking about?
Yes, thank you so much, sir, for your question. And thank you, Bilal, for your question. You're trying to, of course, I'm going to answer you first, but my answer is going to be taken from what Professor Khalid Amin just said, because I was going to refer you to the triangle by Bourdieu, which is the habitus, field, and capital, which explains it is the umbrella, I believe it is the umbrella under which we can categorize all, we can put all the translation theories. Because, and I can give you examples, of course, because according to Bourdieu, he says that, well, each person, for example, who was born in a certain place, he belongs to a certain field. In this field, he develops kind of habitus based on the capital he was endowed with. Therefore, he would react according to the habitus he has. For example, here in Tangier, we live in different parts of Tangier. You live in a certain neighborhood, I live in a certain neighborhood. For example, you have certain practices, you listen to certain types of music, I listen to other types of music. This reflects our different ideologies, our different habitus. You understand me? Therefore, each translation cannot, for example, get rid of his or her ideology. And the example I'm going to provide you with, which answers also the question asked by Dr. Khalid Amin, is, for example, taken from the translation of odes in Shakespeare's Othello. For example, because Khalid Mutran was Muslim, and because he's still, I believe, and because Muhammad Inani is Muslim, they translated zounds as Wallahi, Tallahi. But when it came to Ibrahim Jabra, he translated zounds as Wajuruh al-Masih. Another example to answer Professor Amin's question is the translation of the term the Turks. For example, Khalid Mutran translated the Turks as al-A'da, not al-Atrak, for example, which explains, for example, the extent to which we justifies the extent to which we can use translation as a decolonial, for example, process to strike back, for example, or to express, to talk out about ourselves, to say that here we are, we are striking back in this sense. I hope this partly
Thank
answers
you,
your-
Mohammed. We only have about 2 minutes to close, and I'd like to remind you of what Roland Barthes has said about the author dying upon the birth of his text. I think there is something we miss in this dialectic. It's the reader or the consumer of meaning, because we keep pinning meaning down to the translator. Although the translator is somehow this mediator, but we too somehow bring our meanings into the text. When we read these texts, watch them enacted or staged, I mean, our interpretation differs because our backgrounds differ. And thank you very much. With this, I bring this session to a close. I invite you to watch, maybe to stay in the room, to watch a performance by Banki. He's a storyteller, and I hope you'll enjoy the show. Thank you very much for being so patient and for interacting with our panel. Thank you again.